right now, in every language on earth, in churches and cathedrals and living rooms and hospital rooms, people are saying the same words. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Billions of voices, the same prayer, the same syllables, every single day. And most of those people believe, deeply and genuinely, that they are doing exactly what Jesus commanded them to do. But here is what I need you to understand before we go any further. 6 words, just 6 words before Jesus gives that prayer. He says something that almost nobody who recites it has ever been shown. He tells them not to pray like the pagans do. The pagans pile up empty words. They babble. They repeat and repeat and repeat, thinking that volume is the same thing as faith and that if they say enough, God will eventually have to respond. Do not do that, Jesus says. Your Father already knows what you need before you ask. And then, in the very next sentence, he gives them a prayer. Not pray this. Pray like this. That single distinction, buried in a Greek adverb that most English readers will never see, changes everything about what this prayer is. Not just what the words mean, what prayer itself is, what it means for a human being to approach God. Now, I want to be clear about what this video is not. This is not an attack on the Lord's Prayer. This is not a message telling you that the words you have spoken your entire life mean nothing. This is a video about what Jesus actually said when he gave his disciples a model for prayer, and what happened to those words in the 2,000 years between that hillside in Galilee and the Sunday morning service you sat in last week. Because here is the question that deserves an honest answer. If Jesus spent the sentence immediately before this prayer condemning repetitive, formulaic prayer as a pagan practice, why has the Church spent 2,000 years teaching people to recite it word for word? That is not a rhetorical question. That is a real tension in the text. And what makes that tension urgent is this. Most of the people reciting this prayer every Sunday are not just saying words they were taught as children. They believe they are following an explicit command of Jesus. They deserve to know what that command actually was. I am going to take you into the Greek text of Matthew chapter 6. I am going to show you the word that sits 6 words before the prayer begins, and what it means in the language Jesus taught in. I am going to walk you through the 2 different versions of this prayer recorded in the New Testament, because there are 2, and they are not the same. And I am going to show you exactly when and how this prayer moved from the teaching tool Jesus gave to the formula most Christians say today. If this message is already stirring something in your spirit, hit that like button right now. Every time you do, this goes further, and one more person gets to hear what you are hearing. And if you are not yet subscribed, do that right now, so you do not miss what is coming. Stay with me. Because what comes right before Jesus teaches his disciples to pray is the most important thing most people have never been shown about this passage. And once you see it, you will never read these verses the same way again. To understand what Jesus was doing in Matthew chapter 6, you have to understand what he was walking into. Because when he sat down on that hillside and began to teach, he was not addressing people who had never prayed. He was addressing people who had prayed their entire lives, structured prayer, daily prayer. 3 times a day, every day, standing and facing Jerusalem with the words of the Amidah on their lips. The Amidah was the central prayer of Jewish worship. The name means the standing, because you prayed it on your feet. And it had a structure. It opened with an address to God as the God of the patriarchs. It hallowed the divine name. It petitioned for the coming of the kingdom. It asked for daily provision. It asked for forgiveness. And it closed with a blessing of peace. If that sounds like the framework Jesus gives his disciples a few verses later in Matthew chapter 6, that is not a coincidence. That is Jesus speaking directly into a prayer tradition his disciples had known since childhood. Every one of those categories was already in their bones. He is not handing them something foreign. He is rebuilding something familiar. So Jesus is not introducing prayer to people who have never done it. He is not inventing a new religious practice. He is speaking inside a tradition that was already ancient, already detailed, and already deeply embedded in the daily rhythm of Jewish life. And that changes what his correction means. This is not beginner instruction. This is a teacher pointing at something that went wrong somewhere inside a practice people thought they had right. Now, here is what I need you to understand about the passage where the Lord's Prayer appears. Matthew chapter 6 does not address prayer in isolation. It addresses 3 religious practices in sequence: giving to the poor, prayer, fasting. And for each of the 3, the structure of Jesus' correction is identical. He does not say, stop. He says, stop doing it the way the hypocrites do, because the hypocrites do all 3 of these things publicly, visibly, loudly, in the places where they will be seen. Not whether you do it, how and why you do it. That is the issue in every case, and it is worth sitting with that, because Jesus is not singling prayer out as uniquely broken. He is diagnosing a pattern that had spread across the entire landscape of Jewish piety. When religious practice becomes performance, it all suffers. Tobit 12:8, a text widely known in the Jewish world of Jesus' day, names these 3 practices together directly. Prayer, fasting, and almsgiving are better than any treasure. These were the recognized pillars of Jewish devotion. Jesus does not challenge that. He assumes it. What he challenges is what the heart is doing while the hands and lips go through the motions. And the heart problem he is about to name is specific. It has a name in the Greek, and almost no one has shown it to you. So when Jesus gets to prayer specifically, he identifies 2 problems, 2 very different problems, and the second one, the one that comes right before he gives the model prayer, is the one almost no one talks about. Not because it is obscure, because it requires you to look at the original language. And when you see exactly what word Jesus uses to describe it, you will understand immediately why this matters for every prayer you have ever prayed. When Jesus opens the prayer section of Matthew chapter 6, he names 2 things that have gone wrong. 2 very different kinds of broken prayer. Most people can identify the first one without help. The second one has been so consistently passed over in sermons and Sunday school classes that most Christians have never heard a careful explanation of it. That is the one we need to look at. The first problem is in verse 5. He tells his disciples not to pray like the hypocrites do, and then he describes what the hypocrites do. They love to stand and pray in the synagogues and at the corners of the streets so that they will be seen by others. That is what he is targeting. Not the standing, not the public location, the motive. They want an audience of human beings more than they want an audience with God. And he says that if that is what they are after, that is all they are going to get. But verse 7 is different. This is not about showing off. This is about something else entirely. He tells them not to babble like the pagans do, and the Greek word he uses for that warning is batalogeo. Batalogeo. One word. It appears exactly 1 time in the entire New Testament, right here in Matthew 6:7. The scholars who study the Greek lexicon describe it as babbling, stammering, piling up empty phrases. Some trace it to a man named Batos, legendary for stuttering. Others see it as pure onomatopoeia, a word that sounds like what it describes. Bata bata bata. The sound of mindless repetition. Either way, the picture is the same. And the picture is specific, because this is not just a theoretical warning. Jesus is describing a documented religious practice. In 1 Kings 18:26, the prophets of Baal gathered on Mount Carmel and called on the name of Baal from morning until noon, saying, "Baal, answer us." And there was no voice, and no one answered. That scene tells you exactly what the pagans believed about prayer. If you say the right name enough times, the god eventually has to respond. Volume is leverage. Persistence is devotion. Repetition is the mechanism by which you compel the divine. That is what Bartologeo names. That is the theology Jesus is stepping on. Jesus names that theology, and then he dismantles it in a single sentence. In verse 8, he says that your Father knows what you need before you ask. That is not just a reassurance. That is a complete dismantling of the premise underneath Bartologeo. If your Father already knows what you need, the whole basis of repetitive pressuring prayer collapses. You are not informing him. You are not coercing him. The volume of your words doesn't move him. And that means prayer is something entirely different from what the pagans thought it was. It is not a mechanism for getting God's attention. He already has his attention on you. And then, in the very next verse, he gives them a model prayer. Not a formula to repeat. Not a new incantation to replace the old one. A model for approaching God. And the word he uses to introduce that model is a single Greek adverb, a word that most people who read this passage in English will never see. And that word is where this entire question turns. That is where we are going next. The word is hutos. That is the word that opens the model prayer. Matthew chapter 6 verse 9, in the original Greek, reads this way. Hutos on prosouchesta. 3 words, translating from the Greek as thus, therefore, pray. Together, they mean pray in this manner. It is a short sentence, and one word in it carries more weight than most people have ever been shown. Hutos is a Greek adverb of manner. That distinction matters more than it might first appear. An adverb of manner describes how something is done, not what specific thing must be done. It tells you the shape of an action, the approach, the way of doing it. It does not lock you to a set of words. It does not say, memorize this and repeat it. It says, look at this and learn from the way it is built. That is the difference between a template and a formula. And here is what makes that argument airtight. Hutos is not rare or ambiguous. It appears 208 times in the New Testament. And Matthew uses it in exactly this way throughout his gospel. In chapter 5, verse 16, Jesus says to let your light shine before others hutos. In this way, so that they may see your good works and glorify your Father in heaven. He is not telling them to repeat a specific action word for word. He is describing a manner of living. The word is telling you to take the pattern and go do it, not to take the words and say them back. And in chapter 1, verse 18, the birth of Jesus Christ came about hutos, in this way, and what follows is a narrative description of how it happened. Nobody reads that verse and concludes that the birth must be repeated. The word is describing manner. That is what it always does. Now, here is what I need you to understand about the weight of that. Greek had the vocabulary to command verbatim repetition. If Jesus had wanted his disciples to memorize this prayer and say it back word for word, the language had a phrase for exactly that. The verb leget is the imperative form of say. You use it to mean say this, repeat this, use these specific words. And that is not the word Jesus uses in Matthew chapter 6. He uses hutos, not these exact words. Pray like this. But here is where it gets more complicated, and I want to be honest with you about it. Because in Luke chapter 11, the same prayer appears in a different context, and Luke records a different introduction. He uses the word leget. He does say to pray, saying. That is a real complication, and we are going to look directly at it in an upcoming section. But even leget does not bridge the gap between what Jesus said and the 3 times daily recitation that became standard. That gap is filled by something that came later. What matters here, in this section, is the structural case that Matthew's account makes. Within 4 verses, Jesus has condemned pagan formula prayer, told his disciples that God already knows what they need before they ask, and then introduced the model prayer with an adverb of manner. Those 3 moves are not separate thoughts. They are a single, unified argument about what prayer is. He is showing his disciples something. He is not giving them something to recite. And the word hutos is doing the most important work in that argument. There is something you need to see before we move forward, and it is something that almost nobody who has recited the Lord's Prayer their whole life has ever been told. The Lord's Prayer appears twice in the New Testament, not once. Twice. 2 separate accounts, 2 different books, 2 different contexts, and they are not the same prayer. Most Christians only know one version. It is the one in Matthew chapter 6, beginning at verse 9. Our Father, who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. That is the version most people were taught. That is the version most churches recite on Sunday mornings. That is the version most people have been praying their entire lives. But there is a second version. It is in Luke chapter 11, verses 2 through 4. And almost no one who recites the Matthew version every week has been told that the Luke version exists, or that it is different. Most people will go their entire lives without knowing it is there. Here is what is different. Luke's version is shorter, noticeably shorter. It does not have, who art in heaven. It does not have, your will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. And it does not have, but deliver us from evil. 3 phrases that billions of Christians say every single week are simply not in the prayer Luke records. Now you could argue that Luke just abbreviated. But stop and think about what that means. If Jesus gave his disciples a single exact formula, a prayer meant to be memorized and repeated word for word, you would expect both Matthew and Luke to have recorded the same words. That is not what happened. And then there is the vocabulary difference. In Matthew's version, the forgiveness petition uses the Greek word ophilemata, which means debts, things owed, financial obligations. That is a specific choice of word. It frames the relationship with God through the image of something unpaid, something that must be settled. In Luke's version, the same petition uses the word hamartias, the standard Greek word for sins and moral failures, a different image entirely. 2 different Greek words from 2 different conceptual fields, used for the same petition in 2 different versions of the same prayer. If the specific words of the prayer were what mattered, both writers would have used the same word. They did not. Now, here is what the manuscript evidence adds to this picture. In the later Greek manuscripts, the ones that became the basis of the King James Version, Luke chapter 11 was expanded to match Matthew's longer version almost word for word. But the earlier Greek manuscripts tell a different story. Papyrus 75, Codex Vaticanus, Codex Sinaiticus, all three of them, preserve Luke's prayer in the shorter form. These are the manuscripts scholars consider closer to what Luke actually wrote, and what this pattern of scribal harmonization tells you is exactly what you would expect to find if the prayer had never been given as a single fixed formula in the first place. But here is what the two-version question opens up. Because when Luke records this prayer, he preserves something that Matthew's account does not contain. He tells us what prompted Jesus to teach his disciples to pray at all. He tells us who asked and what they asked for. And that context, the specific moment Luke describes, changes how you read both versions. The two-version problem is not a problem. It is a doorway. And that is where we are going next. The doorway Luke preserves is in chapter 11. Verse 1, Jesus was praying in a certain place, and when he finished, one of his disciples came to him with a request. Lord, teach us to pray, just as John also taught his disciples. Read that request carefully. The disciple is not asking Jesus to hand him a prayer. He is asking Jesus to teach him how to pray. That is a pedagogical request, not a liturgical one. He is asking for competence. He is asking to understand how this is done. He is asking for the skill, not the script. And then there is something about this request that almost everyone overlooks. The disciple does not say, "Give us a prayer the way John gave his disciples a prayer." He says, "Teach us to pray the way John taught his disciples to pray." He is pointing to John's instruction as a model of what he wants. And John, according to the record we have, did teach his disciples to pray. That is confirmed right here in this verse. But here is what is also in the record. John's prayer is nowhere in the New Testament. It simply does not exist in the text. We are told John the Baptist taught his disciples to pray, but whatever he gave them, it was not preserved. Think about what that means. If what John gave his disciples had been a fixed verbal formula, the kind of thing you memorize and repeat word for word, it would have been recorded somewhere. Formulas get preserved. They get written down. They get passed from community to community. What does not get written down is a teaching method, a way of approaching God, a pattern that the disciple takes and makes his own. That is what teachers pass on, not words, understanding. Now, here is the complication I said we would come back to. In Luke chapter 11, verse 2, Jesus responds to the request by saying to pray, saying. The Greek word there is leget. It is an imperative. It means, say, speak these words. And some people will read that and conclude that this settles the question. Jesus used leget. He did mean for these exact words to be said. I understand that reading. It is a real reading of the Greek text, and I am not going to pretend it is not there. But here is what legete does not do. It does not say to recite these words 3 times a day. It does not say, this becomes a fixed communal liturgy. Legete, even read as literally as possible, covers the act of saying the prayer. It does not cover everything the church eventually built around it. The gap between what Jesus says in Luke chapter 11 and what became standard practice is a real gap. And it is filled by something that came later, something written roughly 60 years after Jesus spoke these words. We are going to get there. But first, there is something inside the prayer itself that you need to see. If this message is speaking to something you have never thought about before, hit that like button right now. Every time you do, this reaches someone who has been praying the Lord's Prayer their whole life and deserves to know what they were actually given. Share this with someone before we go further. And if you are not yet subscribed, do that now so you do not miss what comes next. Let me show you what Jesus actually gave when he gave this prayer. Not the words, the architecture. Because once you see the structure underneath the text, it changes how you read everything. The prayer begins with an address. Our Father in heaven. Those 4 words are not a warm-up phrase. They are doing something deliberate. Father is the language of intimacy, of access, of a child coming to a parent rather than a subject approaching a throne. In heaven is the opposite move, a reminder that this Father is not local, not manageable, not confined to what you can see. Both things happening in the same 2-word phrase. That is not accidental. That is the structure of who God is. The second category is hallowing the name. Hallowed be thy name. Before a single petition, before a single request of any kind, you orient yourself toward who God is. His name is holy. His character is set apart. You do not open by telling God what you need. You open by naming what he is. That is the correct order. The third is the kingdom. Thy kingdom come. This is not wishful thinking. This is alignment. You are declaring that God's reign is the goal, that the arc of history is moving somewhere, and that you are placing yourself inside that movement rather than outside of it. When you pray for the kingdom to come, you are not just expressing hope. You are reorienting yourself toward what God is doing in the world. The fourth is the will. Thy will be done, on earth as it is in heaven. There is a gap named in that phrase, between how things are and how they are supposed to be, between the way things work in a fallen world and the way they work in the order God inhabits. And this petition asks for that gap to close. The fifth is provision. Give us this day our daily bread. The Greek word translated as daily is epiousios, and it appears nowhere in surviving ancient Greek outside the 2 passages in Matthew and Luke that record this prayer. Origen, writing in the 3rd century, noted that epiousios was not found in ordinary Greek usage, and may have been coined for this prayer. Whatever its precise meaning, whether today's bread or tomorrow's bread or necessary bread, the category is the same. What you need, brought before, the God who already knows what you need before you ask. The 6th is forgiveness. And here, the prayer does something it does nowhere else. It attaches a condition. You are forgiven, as you forgive. This is also the only petition that Jesus returns to after the prayer ends to expand and explain. He does not go back and unpack the kingdom petition. He does not elaborate on provision. He singles out forgiveness. The category requires something from the one praying. The 7th is deliverance. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. After all of it, after address and awe and kingdom and alignment and provision and forgiveness, the map ends here. Not just absolved of what is past, protected from what is coming. 7 categories: address, awe, kingdom, alignment, provision, forgiveness, deliverance. That is not a script, that is a map of every dimension of what it means for a human being to approach God with nothing held back. Every need is in here. Every category of the human condition before God is covered, and every one of those 7 categories is wide enough to spend a lifetime praying inside without ever repeating yourself. I flagged the forgiveness petition in the last section for a reason. Of the 7 categories in the model prayer, it is the only one that Jesus returns to after the prayer ends. He does not expand the kingdom petition. He does not come back to the provision category and explain what daily bread means. He moves immediately from the last line of the prayer into a focused commentary on one thing only. And that choice tells you something. It tells you what he thought the prayer was for. Verses 14 and 15 of Matthew chapter 6 read like this: "For if you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses." That is not a general theological principle inserted after the prayer by coincidence. That is a direct expansion of the petition in verse 12. Jesus is opening up one of the 7 categories and showing what it actually means to pray it with your whole life and not just your lips. Think about what the selection means. Jesus has just given a model prayer with 7 structural elements, 7 categories of approach. If the point were memorization, he would have taken the disciples through the whole thing. He would have explained each petition, reinforced the wording, made sure they had it right. He does none of that. He expands one petition, and the one he expands is not the most theologically complex. It is not the kingdom or the will or the deliverance. It is the one that requires the most from the person praying. Forgiveness. The place in the prayer where you are most directly implicated. That is not a neutral choice. That is a teacher making clear what the category actually demands. You do not just say the words. You embody the petition. And then there is the vocabulary shift, one of the most overlooked details in this entire passage. Inside the prayer in verse 12, the word for what is forgiven is a philomata, a financial and legal word, meaning debts, obligations, things owed. But in the commentary, Jesus adds in verses 14 and 15, the word changes to paraptomata, which means trespasses, moral failures, false steps. It is a completely different Greek word from a completely different conceptual field. And Jesus makes the switch without comment. If the exact wording of the prayer were sacred, that switch would be inconsistent. If a philomata in verse 12 were the required word, Jesus would not have immediately replaced it with paraptomata in verse 14. The switch tells you that the principle matters, the precise vocabulary does not. So let me name what we now have. Jesus introduced the model prayer with hutos, an adverb of manner, not a formula command. There are 2 versions of the prayer in the New Testament, with different words and different lengths. The disciples ask to be taught how to pray, not given a prayer to recite. The prayer is built from 7 categories, not 7 required clauses. And now, in his own expansion of the prayer, Jesus himself uses a different word for the same petition. Each of these pieces, standing alone, is a piece of an argument. Together, they are one argument. They point in the same direction. And there is still one more piece. It is about the ending you have been reciting your whole life. The ending you have been reciting your whole life is not in the oldest copies of Matthew 6 that we possess. Let that land before we go further. Because everything in this series has been building toward this single fact, and most people who have been saying these words since childhood have never been told it. Not in a Sunday school class, not in a confirmation class, not in a seminary course on the Sermon on the Mount. The ending of the Lord's Prayer, the part that makes the prayer feel complete and ancient and liturgically authoritative, was added. It is not there in the manuscripts that textual scholars consider the earliest and most reliable witnesses to the original text of Matthew's Gospel. The ending I am talking about is this: "For thine is the kingdom, and the power, and the glory, forever and ever. Amen." You know those words. You have said them hundreds of times. They are how the prayer closes in church services and wedding ceremonies and school assemblies and graveside readings. They feel as though they belong to the prayer the way the last brick belongs to an arch. Remove them, and the whole structure seems to collapse inward. Put them back, and the prayer sounds finished, resolved, complete. But here is what you need to understand. The two oldest complete Greek manuscripts of the New Testament, Codex Sinaiticus from the 4th century and Codex Vaticanus from the 4th century, both end Matthew 6:13 without that doxology. The prayer in those manuscripts ends with, "Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil." And then it stops. No kingdom, no power, no glory, no amen. The earliest papyri fragments that preserve portions of Matthew 6 do not contain it either. When the modern critical editions of the Greek New Testament, the Nestle-Aland 28th edition, and the United Bible Society's 5th edition, both of which are compiled from over 5,800 Greek manuscripts, and rank those manuscripts by age and reliability, when those editions print Matthew 6:9 through 13, the doxology is absent, or it is placed in a footnote, or it is bracketed in a way that signals to the reader, this was not original. Every major modern translation of the Bible deals with this honestly. The New International Version, the English Standard Version, the New American Standard Bible, the Christian Standard Bible, and dozens more either omit the doxology from the main text entirely or include it only in a footnote with a note that the earliest manuscripts do not contain these words. This is not a fringe textual position. This is the consensus of everyone who has studied the manuscript evidence. Now, here is what I need you to understand about where that ending actually comes from. The doxology did not appear from nowhere. It has a source, and when you trace it back, the source makes complete sense. In 1 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 11, King David is offering a prayer of dedication as the people bring offerings for the temple. And the language he uses goes like this: "Thine, O Lord, is the greatness, and the power, and the glory, and the victory, and the majesty." It is a doxology of praise. It is the language of a person acknowledging that everything belongs to God. Kingdom and power and glory. That exact cluster of words exists in the Old Testament as the language of worship and acknowledgement directed toward YHWH. So what happened in the early church is not mysterious. As the prayer that Jesus gave began to be used in communal worship, which happened very quickly, the early believers did what worshiping communities have always done. They added liturgical shape to the prayer. They drew on the scriptural language of praise they already knew. They appended a doxology that expressed the right posture before God, and that gave the prayer a felt sense of completeness when spoken aloud in a gathered assembly. And the Didache confirms this. The Didache is the earliest known Christian manual outside of the New Testament, dating to approximately 100 AD. It is a document of early church practice, written within living memory of the apostles, and it tells us explicitly that Christians are to pray the Lord's Prayer 3 times daily. 3 times every day, morning, afternoon, and evening, recited verbatim. And the version of the prayer in the Didache includes a doxology, though a shorter one than the KJV ending. The Didache's version closes with, "For thine is the power and the glory forever." So by 100 AD, within approximately 1 generation of the apostles, the prayer had already moved from the model Jesus gave to a fixed liturgical formula, recited 3 times daily, with an appended doxology. Stay with me, because this is where everything we have covered in this series comes into focus. Go back to what Jesus said in Matthew chapter 6 before he gave the prayer. He said, "When you pray, do not use batologio, empty, meaningless repetitions, as the heathen do. They think they will be heard for their many words." He was describing a specific, broken approach to prayer. The approach that treats prayer as a formula. The approach that treats the right combination of words, repeated with enough frequency and enough volume, as the mechanism through which God is moved. He was pointing at the pagan practices of his day, the incantations and repeated invocations that treated the deity as a machine requiring the correct verbal input. He condemned that approach with one Greek word, batologeo. And then, before he gave the model prayer, he said this: "Your Father knows what you need before you ask him. God already knows." The prayer is not informational. You are not updating God on your situation. You are not pressing the right buttons to unlock divine action. You are not completing a required ritual before God is obligated to respond. God already knows everything you are going to say before you open your mouth. He knew it before you were born. The prayer is not about information delivery. It is about something else entirely. And then came hutos. Pray in this manner. Not these exact words. In this manner. Now look at what the early church did with those instructions. They took the model prayer and they recited it verbatim 3 times a day. They added a doxology to the ending to give it liturgical shape. They turned the template into the formula. They did the precise thing Jesus had just told them not to do. And they did it within 1 generation. Fast enough that the person who wrote the didache considered it established practice. And that doxology, the one that appears in the didache but not in the earliest manuscripts of Matthew, eventually made its way into later Greek manuscripts of Matthew's Gospel. That is how it entered the textual tradition. A liturgical practice that began outside the text eventually found its way into some copies of the text. By the time Erasmus compiled his Greek New Testament from 7 late medieval manuscripts in 1516, the manuscripts he was working from were Byzantine manuscripts from the 11th century and later, and those manuscripts had the doxology. And from Erasmus, the doxology entered the Textus Receptus, and from the Textus Receptus it entered the King James Bible in 1611. And from the King James Bible it entered the memory of every person in the English-speaking world who ever learned to say the Lord's Prayer. But it was not there in the beginning, and here is what makes this so staggering. The prayer that Jesus gave immediately after condemning the recitation of empty liturgical formulas became, within 1 generation, an empty liturgical formula recited 3 times daily with a liturgical ending. The very transformation he warned against happened to the very words he spoke the warning with. And the ending that was added, the ending that billions of people have recited for centuries, was not part of what Jesus originally said. This is not an argument for discarding the Lord's Prayer. That is not the point, and that is not where we are going. The point is what this tells you about how the early church understood the prayer. They understood it as something to be recited. They built communal practice around reciting it. And that understanding, baked into the didache, baked into later manuscripts, baked into centuries of liturgical use, is the lens through which most Christians today have always encountered it. Which means most Christians have never encountered it the way Jesus gave it. They have encountered the liturgical version of it, the domesticated version, the version that had already been shaped by the exact instinct Jesus was addressing when he said, "Do not pray like the pagans." Now, here is what I need you to understand about why this matters more than just a textual footnote. Because we now have every piece of the argument. And what the pieces produce together is not a minor correction. It is a fundamental recalibration of what prayer is. That is where we are going next. Because when you lay every one of these pieces side by side, when you see hutos and batologio, and the two-version problem and what the disciple in Luke actually asked for, and the architecture of the 7 categories, and the forgiveness expansion, and the textual status of the doxology, all of it in one place, the picture that emerges is clear. And it should change how you pray, starting with the next time you bow your head. Let me lay everything out now. Because we have covered a great deal of ground together, and I want you to see it all at once. Not as separate arguments. As one argument. Because that is what it is. Jesus is teaching on the hillside. This is Matthew chapter 6. He is in the middle of the Sermon on the Mount. And he turns to the subject of prayer. He does not begin by giving a prayer. He begins by identifying 2 things that have gone wrong, 2 different kinds of broken prayer that his audience has already learned and already practices. The first broken thing is public performance. People praying on street corners and in synagogues, specifically to be seen by other people. The prayer as social signal. The prayer as proof of righteousness on display. Jesus calls this out and says, "When you pray, go into your room and close the door. Your Father who sees in secret will reward you." The audience for prayer is not the people who can see you. The audience is the Father who is invisible to everyone except you in that private room. That is the first broken thing, and most people can name it without help. The second broken thing is batologeo, empty, meaningless repetition. The piling up of words under the assumption that the volume of words or the repetition of words is what moves God. Jesus calls this the pattern of the pagans, and the reason the pagans prayed this way is that their gods were distant, arbitrary, and fundamentally uninterested in individual human beings. If you wanted a pagan deity to act on your behalf, you had to get the deity's attention and hold it long enough to extract the favor you needed. You did this through ritual performance, through incantation, through the repetition of specific words that the deity had, at some point, responded to. The prayer was a technology. You used the right inputs to produce the desired output. Batologeo. Jesus says, do not pray like that. And the reason is immediate. He states it in the very next sentence. Your Father already knows what you need before you ask him. God is not distant. God is not uninterested. God is not waiting for you to say the right words in the right sequence before he can locate your problem on his list. He already knows. He has always known. The prayer is not information for God. The prayer is something else. It is orientation for you. And then comes hutos. Pray in this manner. The word matters. It is an adverb of manner. It tells you the category of instruction you are receiving. Jesus is not saying recite these words. He is saying, let this structure shape your approach. Let this be the architecture of how you come to God. The categories are the instruction. The specific words inside those categories are yours to bring. And then we have the Luke account. Luke chapter 11, verse 1. Jesus is praying in a certain place. When he finishes, one of his disciples comes to him with a specific request. Lord, teach us to pray, just as John also taught his disciples. This is the context Luke preserves, and Matthew does not. The disciple who made this request had been watching Jesus pray. He had seen what prayer looked like when Jesus did it. He had seen the intimacy and the attention and the posture and the duration. And what he said was not give me a prayer. He said teach me to pray. That is a different request. That is a student asking a teacher to give him access to something, not to hand him a product. And what Jesus gave him is not the same prayer that appears in Matthew. Luke's version is shorter. It has fewer petitions. The wording is different in places. If Jesus was handing his disciples a fixed liturgical formula to recite, a formula in which every word was the point, then two different versions of the formula cannot both be correct. But if Jesus was modeling a pattern of approach, a framework that could be expressed in different words and different levels of detail, because the words themselves were not the point, then two different versions presenting the same structure with the same categories in the same order is exactly what you would expect. And that is what we have. Now look at the structure. The prayer opens with an address. Our Father in heaven, or in Luke, Father. Two different forms of address, both doing the same thing, establishing who you are coming to and from what position you are coming. You are a child. He is a father. You are approaching from below. He is enthroned above. That relational and hierarchical orientation is the foundation of everything that follows. Then come the first three petitions, and they are all God-directed. Hallowed be your name. Your kingdom come. Your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. These are not requests for yourself. These are statements of alignment. You are placing yourself in the correct relationship to God before you bring a single thing you need. You are saying what matters to you before you ask for what you need. And what you say matters is God's reputation, God's reign, and God's will. In that order. Then the petitions turn toward the human. Give us this day our daily bread. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. Provision, forgiveness, deliverance. Three categories of human need, and each one is enormous. Each one is wide enough to spend a lifetime praying inside without ever using the same words twice. 7 categories in total, not 7 required phrases. 7 territories of prayer. God's honor, God's kingdom, God's will, daily provision, relational forgiveness, protection from temptation, deliverance from evil. Every dimension of what it means to be a human being standing before God is covered in those 7 territories. There is nothing you will ever need to bring to God that does not fit inside one of those categories. And inside each category, there is infinite room for the specific, particular, unrepeatable language of your actual life. This is the template. This is what Hautos points to. Pray like this. Pray in a way that moves through these territories. Start with alignment. Start with God's priorities before your own. Then bring your needs, provision and forgiveness and protection. And when you come to forgiveness, come honestly, because the condition Jesus attaches to that petition is a searching one. Forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors. Not as we intend to forgive, not as we plan to forgive when we get around to it. As we have forgiven. Present perfect tense. The forgiveness you are asking for is being measured against the forgiveness you have already extended. And then Jesus does something he doesn't do with any other category. He expands it. The prayer ends, and he immediately returns to the forgiveness petition. He spends the next 2 verses on it specifically. If you forgive others their trespasses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive others their trespasses, neither will your Father forgive your trespasses. He did not come back to daily bread and explain what provision looks like. He did not come back to your kingdom, come and elaborate on what the kingdom means. He did not come back to deliverance from evil and define the evil he had in mind. He came back to one thing: forgiveness. And when he expanded it, he used a different Greek word than the word in the prayer itself. He used aphime, to release, to let go, to send away. He is saying that the forgiveness God extends toward you and the forgiveness you extend toward others are not two separate transactions. They are one transaction with two sides. You cannot receive what you refuse to pass along. That expansion is Jesus himself teaching you how to pray inside the forgiveness category. It is not a separate teaching on a separate subject. It is the only example he gives anywhere in this passage of what it looks like to actually occupy one of the 7 territories with real content. And the content is not a formula. It is not the repeated phrase, "Forgive us our debts." It is the actual condition of your actual relationships, examined honestly before God and surrendered. And then there is the doxology. For thine is the kingdom and the power and the glory forever. Absent from the oldest manuscripts, present in the didache with a slightly different form, present in later manuscripts, entered the textual tradition through liturgical practice, added by the early church as the prayer moved from template to formula, added to an ending that Jesus himself didn't add. Now lay it all out in order. Jesus condemned empty repetition as pagan prayer behavior. He said God already knows what you need before you ask. He introduced the model prayer with an adverb of manner, not an adverb of exact quotation. He gave 2 different versions of the prayer in 2 different contexts to 2 different audiences. The disciple who prompted the Luke account asked to be taught how to pray, not to be given a fixed prayer. The prayer itself is built from 7 categories, wide enough to hold a lifetime of unrepeated prayer. Jesus expanded exactly 1 category after the prayer ended, and he expanded it with honest relational content, not a phrase to repeat. And the ending everyone associates with the prayer was added after the fact, not by Jesus, and the earliest manuscripts do not contain it. Every single one of those pieces is pointing at the same thing. Jesus was not handing his disciples a liturgy. He was showing them a posture. He was giving them a map. He was describing what it looks like when a human being comes to God with nothing held back, nothing performed, nothing repeated, because repetition makes it feel more real. He was describing prayer that begins with orientation rather than petition. Prayer that prioritizes God's agenda before presenting a list of personal needs. Prayer that requires honest self-examination in the forgiveness territory rather than the recitation of a phrase that slides past the conscience without disturbing it. Prayer that takes seriously the claim that God already knows, which means the prayer is not for God's information, but for the person praying. It forms you, it orients you, it places you correctly in relation to who God is and who you are before you say a single word about what you need. That is what Jesus gave his disciples when they asked him to teach them to pray. It was never a liturgy. It was never a formula. It was never a sequence of syllables to be said 3 times daily as a spiritual obligation. It was a map of the interior life of someone who actually knows who they are talking to. And now you know what it was, which means the next question is the one that changes everything for you personally, and that is the question of what you do with it. Here is what I need you to sit with for a moment before we go any further. If the Lord's Prayer is a template and not a text, then every time you have recited it, you were doing something real and something incomplete at the same time. Real because the categories are right. The orientation it points you toward is exactly the orientation Jesus intended. Every time you said, "Hallowed be thy name," you were doing what the prayer structure calls you to do, which is to start with God's honor before your own needs. Every time you said, "Forgive us our debts," you were moving into the forgiveness territory and acknowledging before God that you need what you cannot earn. The structure of the prayer is right. The categories are the gift. The prayer is not wrong, but incomplete because no fixed sequence of words prayed on a schedule by itself produces the thing that Jesus was describing. The thing he was describing is an actual encounter, a real transaction, a person coming to God with genuine orientation toward who God is and genuine honesty about what they need. A person who examines the forgiveness category rather than sliding through it. A person who actually means, "Give us this day our daily bread," which requires the person praying to know what they need today, specifically, in the circumstances of their actual life today, and not of a generic life they are imagining. The recitation can be the doorway into that. It was never supposed to be the destination. So what does prayer that takes Jesus at his word actually look like? Not in theory, in practice. What changes on Tuesday morning at 6 o'clock when you bow your head? Here is where we start. You start where Jesus started. Not with your list. With God, hallowed be your name. Before a single word about what you need, you stop and you acknowledge who you are talking to. Not as a warm-up phrase to get the engine running, as an actual orientation. What does God's name mean to you today? What about who God is makes him worthy of being the first word out of your mouth? This is not a rhetorical exercise. It is a reorientation. The prayer forces you to look up before you look in. It places God at the center of the conversation before you occupy that center yourself. Most of us come to prayer already narrating our own story, our own problems, our own requests. Jesus' model says stop. Before your story, there is God's story, and your story only makes sense inside God's story. Then your kingdom come, your will be done on earth as it is in heaven. This is an alignment petition. You are saying that your preferences for how today goes are subordinate to God's purposes for how today goes. You are saying that where your will and God's will diverge, you choose his. That is not a small prayer. That is not a phrase you coast through on your way to the part that feels more immediately relevant. If you actually mean those words, you have just placed the entire day under a different authority than your own preferences. You have said in advance that the disruptions and the disappointments and the things that do not go according to your plan may be exactly the will of God being done on earth as it is in heaven, and you are choosing that. Now you have reoriented yourself. Now you have aligned yourself. Now you come to provision. Give us this day our daily bread. And here is what the model requires of you at this point. You have to know what your bread is today. Not in general, today. What do you actually need? What are the specific things in front of you today that require God's provision? The prayer does not allow you to stay at the level of abstraction where you say, "I need your provision," and move on. It presses you toward specificity. Daily bread. What is the bread for today? Name it. Bring it to God by name. Because God already knows, as Jesus told you, and the naming is not for his information. The naming is for yours. The act of naming what you need today is an act of acknowledging that you cannot produce it yourself. That acknowledgement is the prayer, and then the forgiveness territory. And I want to be honest with you about this one because Jesus was. When you arrive at "forgive us our debts, as we also have forgiven our debtors," you cannot stay at the level of the phrase. The phrase is not the prayer. The prayer is the actual state of your actual relationships, brought honestly before God. Is there someone you are withholding forgiveness from? Is there someone you have been wronged by, and the debt is still on the ledger? Is there a conversation you are avoiding, and a wound you are keeping fresh because releasing it feels like letting the person who caused it off the hook? That is the territory, and the prayer calls you to enter it honestly, because what Jesus said after the prayer is not a comment on the side. It is the only expansion he gave. If you forgive others, your Father will forgive you. If you do not, he will not. That is not a threat. That is a description of how this works. You are not a terminal point for forgiveness. You are a conduit. What God extends toward you is designed to flow through you toward others. When you stop the flow, the dynamic changes, and the prayer asks you to examine whether the flow is stopped every time, not as a ritual phrase, as an honest examination, and then lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. This is the prayer of someone who knows themselves, someone who knows that their own impulses and inclinations and the pressures of the environment they live in have the potential to pull them away from the life they said they wanted when they said, "Your will be done." You are asking God to protect you from the version of yourself that would choose wrongly if left without divine guidance. This is not a passive prayer. It is an active acknowledgement of your own susceptibility. It is the prayer of a person who is not overconfident about their own virtue. Now here is what I want you to see about the whole structure of that. None of what I just described requires you to say the Lord's Prayer. The Lord's Prayer is a map of those territories. But you can pray inside those territories for an hour without ever using a single phrase from Matthew 6. You can pray inside the provision category in the language of your actual circumstances today. You can pray inside the forgiveness category with the actual name of the person you need to release. You can pray inside the deliverance category with the actual temptations you know you face this week. You can spend more time in some territories than others depending on what is pressing on your life today. The map tells you where to go. You bring the specifics. But here is something else I want to say. Because I am not telling you never to recite the Lord's Prayer, what I am telling you is that if you recite it as an entrance into the territories, not as a completion of an obligation. Let hallowed be your name actually stop you for a moment and direct your attention toward the holiness and the greatness of the God you are talking to. Let your will be done actually require something of you as you say it. Let forgive us our debts make you honest. Let the prayer do what Jesus designed it to do, which is not to satisfy a spiritual requirement by completing a sequence of words, but to orient you, shape you, align you, and open you toward the God who already knows everything you are about to say and who chose to invite you to say it anyway. That invitation is the most extraordinary thing about prayer. God does not need your prayer. He already knows. He is not waiting for your description of your situation before he can act. He knows your situation with a precision you will never achieve yourself. And yet, he invited you into a conversation, not because he needs the information, because you need the orientation. You need the daily practice of placing yourself in right relationship to who he is before you navigate who you are and what you need. You need the forgiveness examination, because without it, the unforgiveness calcifies and hardens, and eventually you stop feeling it, even though it is still there. You need the alignment petition, because without it, you slowly and quietly begin assuming that your preferences for your life are the same as God's purposes for your life, and they are not always the same. The prayer Jesus gave does something to the person who prays it honestly. It is not magic. It is not formula. It is orientation. It is the daily practice of becoming the kind of person who knows who God is, who knows what they need, who is honest about the state of their relationships, and who knows their own susceptibility to the things that pull them away from the life they want to live. That is the person the prayer is designed to form over time, not the person who says it, the person who prays it. And that distinction is the entire point of everything Jesus said before he gave it. I want to speak to you directly now before this ends. Not to the general audience, not to the category of people who find this interesting as a piece of biblical scholarship. To you specifically, the person who has been listening to all of this, and something has been moving in you that is more than intellectual engagement. Maybe you have been reciting the Lord's Prayer your whole life. Maybe you learned it as a child, in a church, from a parent, in a classroom. Maybe you have said it hundreds or thousands of times and you meant it every time, or most of the time. And somewhere over the years it became the kind of thing you say when you bow your head without fully arriving at the place the prayer was meant to take you. Maybe it became a frame with no painting inside it. The structure was there. The words were there. But the interior reality that Jesus was pointing toward when he gave it, that was less certain. If that is where you are, I want to tell you something. What you just heard is not a correction designed to make you feel like you have been doing it wrong. It is an invitation, because if the Lord's Prayer is a map and not a magic phrase, and if what Jesus cared about was not the syllables but the orientation, then everything that has felt hollow or routine or incomplete about your prayer life is not a final verdict on you. It is a starting point. You know the territories now. You know what each category of the prayer is reaching toward. You know that hallowed be. Your name is not throat-clearing. It is the most important reorientation you will do all day. You know that your will be done is the most costly prayer in the model because it requires you to mean it, which means accepting in advance that what God wants and what you want may not always be the same thing. You know that the forgiveness territory requires honesty, not just the phrase, and that the honesty it requires is specifically about the places where you are withholding what God has extended to you. You know that lead us not into temptation is the prayer of someone who takes their own susceptibility seriously rather than assuming their own virtue. You know all of that now, and knowing it, you can pray today in a way that is more honest, more specific, more oriented, and more alive than anything recitation alone could produce. But I also want to say something to a different person, someone who has been listening to this whole series, and the thing that has been moving in you is not just a desire to pray differently. It is something older and deeper, the realization that you have been going through the motions of religious life without having the underlying relationship that all of it points toward. You have said the words. You have been in the buildings. You have known the calendar and the rituals and the right answers to give when someone asks what you believe. But underneath all of it, there is a question you have never fully answered. Do I actually know the Father that this prayer is addressed to? Is the Our Father an address I use because it is familiar, or is it the actual language of an actual relationship? That question matters more than anything else we have discussed today. Because everything Jesus said in Matthew 6 about prayer assumes a relationship. When he says your Father knows what you need before you ask, that is only meaningful if there is actually a Father, and you are actually his child. When he says, go into your room and close the door and pray to your Father who is in secret, that assumes your Father is there. When he teaches you to begin prayer with Our Father in heaven, he is assuming that the person praying has access to that address. That access is not automatic. It is not inherited by proximity to religion. It is given to the person who has received what God made it possible to receive. And what God made possible is the clearest fact in the New Testament. God sent his Son into the world, not to condemn the world, but that the world through him might be saved. That is John 3:17. And the verse before it, the one everyone knows, says God so loved the world that he gave his only Son, that whoever believes in him should not perish but have eternal life. Whoever. That word has no exceptions in it. No fine print, no qualification based on how long you have waited, or what you have done, or how far you feel from the relationship the prayer assumes. Romans chapter 10 verse 9 says this, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. That is the promise, not a program, not a ritual you complete correctly, a confession and a belief, an acknowledgement of who Jesus is and what God did through him, made honestly from the interior of your actual life. If you have never done that, or if you did it once long ago and you are not sure it was real, or not sure it still applies to you, this is the moment. Not because you happened to find this video, because God already knows what you need before you ask. And what you need is not just a better understanding of how to pray. What you need is the Father who the prayer is addressed to. You can speak to him right now. Not with a formula, with honesty. Something like this. Father, I believe that Jesus is your Son, and that you raised him from the dead. I am asking you for the relationship that this prayer assumes. I am coming to you, not because I have earned access, but because Jesus made access possible. Receive me. I am yours. If you prayed something like that and you meant it, the access you asked for is yours. Not because of the prayer, because of what the prayer reached toward, because of the one who made the reaching possible. If this series has changed how you think about prayer, or if something in this message moved something in you that you were not expecting, I want to hear from you. Leave a comment below. Tell me where you are. Tell me what landed. Tell me what you are going to do differently the next time you bow your head. Those comments are not just responses to a video. They are a community of people who are taking the same thing seriously at the same time, and there is something real about that. If this message spoke to something you have been carrying for a long time, hit that like button right now. Every time you do, this reaches someone else who has been saying these words their whole life and deserves to know what they were actually given. Share this with someone before today is over. Not because it helps a channel's numbers, because there is someone in your life who has been going through the motions and who needs to hear that what Jesus gave was not a ritual, it was a relationship. And if you are not yet subscribed, do that now, and turn on the bell so you do not miss what comes next in this series, because we are not done, and where we go next goes even deeper into what the original text actually says versus what most people have been taught. Jesus gave his disciples something more alive than any liturgy. He gave them a way of coming to God that was shaped like an intimate conversation between a child and a father, who already knows everything, but who chooses to be asked anyway. He gave them 7 territories, wide enough to hold the weight of an entire human life. He gave them a structure that begins with God and ends with the honest acknowledgement of human need, and he gave them that structure in 2 different forms, in 2 different contexts, to make sure no one mistook the map for the territory. That map is still yours, every morning, every afternoon, every evening, every room with the door closed, every honest examination of the forgiveness category, every surrender inside your will be done, every specific naming of today's bread. That is the prayer Jesus gave, and it was never meant to be repeated. It was meant to be lived inside, every single day.